Somewhere far away from the city, on one of the most ordinary data plots, there was a cheerful and rather noisy party. The country house was decorated with colorful garlands. If you looked from afar, it could seem that the house was drowning in fireflies, lots of bright lights. Cheerful and relaxed voices could be heard coming from the property. You'd think it was some teenagers celebrating a big day, but the house did not belong to teenagers. A couple that had been living together for more than 20 years had decided to have a party. At first glance, it might seem that the party was held on some important and significant occasion. There were too many people in the house, and the music was too loud. But the truth was much more interesting. In fact, the couple had these parties for no reason at all. Every weekend they went somewhere free from work, and the day did not pass for them in vain. And this time, the family arranged a party without a reason, simply because they could afford it, simply because they loved fun and liked to be in the center of attention. But the occasion they didn't need at all. They lived each of their days as many do not celebrate. The occasion, their weddings or anniversaries. Each of their days started with smiles and ended with the brightness of lights. Many people were invited to that country party, numerous relatives, couples, friends, classmates. It seemed that each of the guests was happy to be there and fully supported the cheerful atmosphere of that party. But it seemed so only at first glance. But one woman stood far away from everyone. In her hands was a paper cup with champagne, and on her face froze discontent. It was because she had recently gone through another divorce. The woman had known the hosts of the holiday couple for more than 20 years, and all these 20 years she wondered the same question, how they managed to do it. The woman herself had been married many times over the years, but each of her marriages was not destined to be happy and long. Her first husband she caught fought with a mistress, the second husband turned out to be a swindler that only wanted to deceive her, and the third husband turned out to be a real tramp, not wanting to work and bring money into the family. And the fourth husband left her himself after all. She had already cheated for her almost 50 years. She had not managed to find happiness in family life, therefore, other people's happiness was painful to her soul. She had known Ella and Max since they were young. They had all gone to circus school together, and all these years she had envied their happiness and their love. Taking a big sip of champagne, she squared her shoulders and walked toward where the party hosts were standing. Seeing her fellow student, Ella, the hostess of that house, smiled. "Kate, I haven't seen you all evening. Come quickly to us." Hearing his wife's words, Max also smiled without releasing his hand of steel from his spouse. He waved his friend with his free hand, inviting her to come over, and really, "Kate, where have you disappeared? I haven't heard a word from you all evening. Where have you been?" Kate came closer and smiled demurely. "Never mind. I wasn't in the mood." "How are you?" she asked gently. "How's family life?" "Family life, as always, everything is great," Ella replied, still smiling happily. "I don't remember it ever being any different." "Yes, Max," she asked her husband with a wink. "We're doing great," he nodded. "So where's your soulmate? I remember we invited you to more than one." "I'm divorced," Kate answered dry. "Just yesterday was the court," Ella replied with a gasp, spreading her hands. "How could it be, Kate? How could it be?" Max supported his wife in surprise. Kate stretched it out. "You've got to be kidding me. What happened this time?" "Never mind," she looked at her friend with a kind of sadness. "It's just that we're different people. We don't see eye to eye." Ella nodded in response. "Yes, it happens, but don't get upset. It's still ahead of you." Kate clucked her tongue. How do you know? How do you know?" "Ella, you got married once, and everything is fine." The hostess slightly tilted her head to the side. "Yeah, well, I was lucky. I met my love when I was a student, but that doesn't mean I live in a bubble. After all, I have 2 sisters, and Max has a brother. We have a lot of acquaintances, friends. We've heard all kinds of stories. By the way, what is your marriage?" "The 3rd? 4th, answered Kate. "I've known you for as long as I've known you. I can't understand how you managed it." "Did what?" Max asked. "What do you mean, what's such a long and happy marriage?" Max and Ella looked at each other and laughed in unison. "We just love each other," they answered at the same time and laughed again. "It's just that we are destined for each other." Also, the two of them replied, seeing their happy faces. Kate twitched. "How happy?" She replied ironically, "No, really, tell me, how did you manage to live so many years together and never quarrel?" "What's your secret, Kate?" "We don't have a secret. We're just compatible, like yin and yang," laughing Max replied. "That's how Ella got involved. There's no secret. We're just lucky, I guess." Kate rolled her eyes. "Don't answer in a generalized way. I need some advice." "How many years have you two been together?" "Very soon we will have a silver wedding. 25 years, Ella answered. "I don't know what advice to give you. Maybe you should take a look at our Sam. You know, we went to school together. I thought he was courting you." Kate waved her hand indifferently in her direction. "Well, you're all clear. You don't want to share any secrets," she chuckled. "How will you celebrate your silver wedding?" "I can't believe that people like you won't organize a real celebration." "Of course, we'll celebrate," Max said, smiling broadly, "but I won't tell you how. I want to surprise Ella." Kate looked at the couple with a squint. "I think I know what your secret is," she said suddenly. "What is it?" Max asked. "The fact that you don't have children." Hearing this, on Ella's face her smile disappeared, her gaze dropped, and her shoulders slumped. "What good is that?" she asked. "Well, you don't spend money on children, you live at your pleasure, and you have no obligations. You live as you like." Ella closed her eyes for a few seconds, then opening them, she asked, trying to make her voice sound friendly, "So, your daughter is a burden to you?" "Of course not," Kate answered. "A daughter is the best thing that has happened in my life, but you don't understand. You're different. You don't need motherhood, do you?" Ella tried to pull herself together for a few more seconds, but it was getting harder. After looking at her friend for a while with a judgmental look, she suddenly turned around and walked away. Luda looked after her proudly. With a sense of satisfaction, she smiled slightly, turning again toward Max, who remained standing there in indecision, and asked, trying on the fool's mask, "Oh, did I offend our Ella in any way?" "How unfortunate," she said with feigned regret. "But why would she be offended?" "Because everything I said was true, wasn't it?" "What's there to be offended about?" "I don't seem to understand all this. You see," Kate answered, the host of the feast, "you know, Ella always wanted children. If she had, would you have taken from the orphanage?" Parried the one, "And Ella just doesn't need it. She can't stand responsibility. All she wants to do is go out. She just wants to have fun." She lowered her voice. "But are you the same way? Haven't you ever dreamed of having a family full of kids?" "Think about it," she said with a wink. Then Kate left the party, planting a shadow of doubt in this friendly family. Max and Ella really were compatible within this friendly family, each other. They had indeed been happily married for nearly 25 years now. Many of their mutual acquaintances often marveled at how similar the couple were, and that was the truth. When they were young, they often joked that they had one brain for two. Ella entered the circus school with one goal. She wanted fame. She wanted to be an artist. She wanted to perform on stage, feeling the eyes of the audience on her. Max, on the other hand, when he entered the same school, wanted something a little different. He wanted to organize performances rather than be a direct participant in them. They met there at the circus school and fell in love with each other at first sight. Maybe Ella was not immediately ready for such a reproach, but still, she wanted to devote herself to the stage and not the family. But her classmates, at that time, Max was more than persistent. Having managed to conquer the beautiful Ella, he got her heart once and for all. The couple managed to get married before graduation. At some point, their classmates stopped perceiving them as separate individuals. One day, they became one for everyone. No one considered them separately. One day, they became Max and Ella, forgetting that they were even strangers. When they graduated, it seemed they wanted very different things. While Margarita dreamed of the stage, Misha dreamed of better organizing and decorating the stage. Thus, in their heads at the same time came a wonderful idea. They opened their own agency for the arrangement of holidays and devoted their whole lives to this business. At first, the young couple were the only employees in their small firm, actively advertising their services. They slowly began to take orders for children and not only holidays. They spent all their money on props, buying up all kinds of costumes. Who only they were not: Santa Claus with Snow Maiden, the heroes of children's fairy tales, Lunac, and all sorts of evil on Halloween, elves, and dwarves. Even the heroes of famous movies they were, and parody pop stars, trying on different roles. As time went on, their agency grew larger and larger. Over time, there were even hired actors performing the main roles. Max quickly moved away from cases related to performances dealing with the organization. Ella, in turn, performed for many years, wanting to attract attention to themselves, wanting to shine, no matter what. After 10 years of hard work, their business had grown to unprecedented proportions. They already had many professional actors under their employ. They even managed to open a small chain of stores selling props for holidays and performances. When they both turned 30 years old, their lives faced the question that almost everyone asks at their age: it's time to think about children. They decided one day, but God had other plans for them, and children, as it turned out, they were not destined to have. The first few years, Ella tried to get pregnant, but as it turned out, it was impossible. 3 years later, without productive attempts, she went to counseling and found out a terrible thing: she was infertile. For a few months, the young woman closed herself off from the rest of the world, falling into depression. But her loving and faithful husband helped her to cope with it, and the idea of becoming parents was forgotten forever. Since then, they have fully devoted themselves only to work. And that's when their business brought them closer together. By the jubilee of 20 years, they became a real role model. The family couple even spoke at conferences, sharing their experience with the young, explaining to them how to develop their business from scratch. They were real workaholics, but they never forgot about entertainment. Max and Ella were fun-loving people, and their house was always full of guests. Every weekend, they spent positively in nature, in the spa, or even went to the movies, shopping, or to a restaurant. Their parties were considered to be almost the best in town. They were known as the best organizers and just fun people. Each of their days was like a holiday, and each holiday resembled a real festival. They were known as people who were reckless, frivolous, and sociable. But few knew what they had to endure for many years. Ella did not even think about a possible pregnancy, but the moment she found out that she would not become a mother, it was a real blow to her. When she was 20 years old, she did not even think about family and children, dreaming only of fame. When she was 25, she could only wave off annoying relatives, saying that she will think about children sometime later. At 30, Ella also did not worry, deciding that it was not yet time. But at 33, upon discovering her illness, she realized that she would never experience the happiness of motherhood. She often thought of herself as a spoiled woman, as wrong in something. She was not looking at her younger sisters, each of whom had 2 children. She felt a real sadness come over her. It had taken her many years to accept herself and live a normal life. It was then that she decided she would be, if not a better mother, then a better aunt to her nephews. Max also had 2 nephews. The children of their in-laws considered them the best uncles and aunts and were always waiting for them to show up. Early in their careers, they often pretended to be magicians. The children at whose parties they performed considered them the best of the best, long remembering their performances. Max and Ella often played Santa Claus and Snow Maiden, and after some time of their career, it was as if they really became these heroes. They were loved and waited for by everyone, from small to great. And here, in the family of the organizers, entertainers, was approaching an important date. Very soon, they were to celebrate the silver wedding, 25 years of life together. Of course, having prepared an unusual and bright celebration, they did not forget to please each other with surprises. Telling his wife that he was going to another city for a wholesale purchase for their stores, Max began to pack his things, going on an important journey. Max was indeed going to another city, but not for shopping at all. In fact, he decided to prepare an unusual gift for his wife. Since the spouses knew each other well, Max knew what his wife's main dream was since childhood. Ella dreamed of one day performing alone in front of a large hall of spectators. It was on their wedding anniversary that Ella realized it was time to make that dream come true. To do it all in secret, he had to look for a suitable venue in another city. This way, there was less chance of his wife finding out at the wrong time about the grand surprise. He found a suitable venue and negotiated for a long time to rent the venue for Ella's performance. Ella had never made it to the big stage, though, and she had left acting during the holidays quite some time ago. She still had something to show for it. She worked out several times a week, keeping her body strong and healthy. And she had an unusual conversation, her own fully prepared acrobatic number, which she dreamed of someday showing to the audience. Having agreed with the venue, Max began active preparation for this performance, which the speaker did not even know about. A couple of days before the holiday, Max, having warned his wife about his departure, was ready to leave. Ella came out to see him off, and they had an unusual conversation. "Are you sure you need to leave now?" She leaned back tiredly against the door in the hallway, seeing her husband off. "Maybe we can go together later." "Ella, why? You used to like to be alone." "I used to, but I haven't been feeling well lately. Maybe I should hold off on the shopping." "You don't feel well? What's wrong with you?" He let go of the bag and rushed over to his wife in his shoes. No, you misunderstand me. Physically, I feel fine, but mentally, I'm feeling a little anxious lately. I literally don't know where to put myself." He took his wife's hands. "Why, Ella, what's wrong?" He took his wife's hands insistently and looked into her eyes. "Do you remember what Kate said?" She sighed heavily. "I thought she said all that for a reason." "What did she say?" "I don't remember." He took a step back, a little nervous. "About the kids, you remember the tone she used, like she was bowing down to me. I can't get that conversation with Kate out of my head." "Now I remembered," he chuckled. "Screw her, she just can't find a man, so she's freaking out." "No, it's not that. It's just my imagination." "Forget it, though." "No, say it," he said. "Tell me what you imagined." "I'm about to leave the house, let's not leave it open." "It seemed to me like she was flirting with you and trying to humiliate me. You know that's not a good thing." "Well, what do you say?" He laughed. "That can't be right." "Yes, I know, she replied, relaxing slightly. "I understand everything. I know," she replied perfectly well, "but I can't get it out of my head." "Don't worry," her husband answered her and pulled her into a hug. "Now is not the time for nerves. We have a very important date." "I remember," she replied quietly. A second later, their conversation was interrupted by the sound of a text message. Ella reached into the pocket of her silk robe and furrowed her brow as she read the incoming message. "Who's there?" asked Max, something work-related. No, she giggled nervously. "So when are you coming back?" she asked with interest. He looked at his wife incredulously. "Why, are you already okay with my trip?" He took a wide step to peep into her cell phone screen, but his wife blocked the phone with a swift movement of her hand and slipped it back into her pocket. She kissed her husband and replied, "I would certainly hate for you to leave, but since it's necessary." She paused. "So, will he?" he answered confidently. "You be back?" she insisted again. "Friday," he answered confidently, lying to his wife for some reason. "And who wrote to you?" "You know, you're weird," she smiled, her charming smile, and tucked a lock of blonde hair behind her ear. "Pam was just asking when I could meet her." "Pam who?" He continued to frown as if he suspected Bogdanov of something. She answered drily and confidently, "You remember her, right? Well, good." He approached his wife again and kissed her forehead. "But I'm going." "Drive," she smiled and moved closer to the door to close it. That same night, Max boarded the plane and left on his secret business. As he sat at the airport, he was overcome with agonizing doubts. Ella was acting strangely, he thought. It seems that she is beginning to suspect something. But on arrival, all doubts seemed to disappear. He plunged into the process of organizing the concert, literally forgetting everything. When everything was ready, the venue was rented, even the tickets for Ella's performance were almost sold out. Satisfied with himself, Max got ready to go home, tentatively so as not to arouse unnecessary suspicion. He made a small purchase for their store and, while he was selecting the goods, he thought up a little prank for his favorite wife. He returned 2 days earlier than he had told Ella, having rented a hotel for 2 nights. He began to prepare for the prank. He came up with a simple plan of how he could cheer up his spouse and let her relax a little. Since he had been working in the holiday industry for a long time, the art of applying makeup was more than familiar to him. While in another city, he bought a doctor's costume and makeup paints for his size. While at the hotel, he applied the makeup, changing his face beyond recognition, and hailed a cab back to his home. The plan was to go to their house disguised as a psychiatric doctor and say that the neighbors were complaining about the noise. Then he planned to play out her detention, say she was being taken to the White House, and taken to the hotel he had rented to start celebrating their holiday before. He quietly entered the apartment at the appointed time. When Max, already in character, arrived at his house, he quietly entered the apartment and went in search of his wife. What was his surprise when he found his wife in the bedroom? At a bad time, and all would be nothing. But in their family nest, Ella was not alone. He went into the bedroom and was literally stunned. There, on their bed, was his wife sitting in a characteristic pose. She was wearing a black latex suit, her face was half hidden by a mask, and in her hand, she held a very recognizable whip. And on the bed lay some unfamiliar, whip unknown to him. The man was handcuffed to the headboard. The man was almost naked, and if his wife's face was hidden behind a mask, his face could be seen in more detail. It was as if the man was in a trance. He could only flap his eyes in surprise and stare at Ella in amazement. As soon as Max was about to open his mouth and make a real scandal, in his throat, a cramp went through him and he could not get a word out of himself. All because he got a better look at his wife's lover and suddenly recognized him. Strapped to their bed was one of the most respected men in their town, Andrew. He owned a chain of car washes, cafes, hotels, and was also a deputy from the Legislative Assembly of the region, as well as, of course, a very, very rich man. Max and Ella had visited him several times. They knew his wife well, and Andrew's wife was a real beauty. She was an actress in the local theater. She and Andrew had 3 children, and he was considered a serious, decent, and family-oriented man. Max shifted his gaze to his wife. Maybe it wasn't her at all, and he was just imagining things. But once again looking at the body, familiar to the point of pain, he realized that there was no way to justify her. Her costume consisted of a 2-piece bra and long jaws. The deceived spouse managed to notice a tattoo on her lower back, which Ella had made when she was a student. The woman danced a strange, even frightening dance in front of her lover. From time to time, she got off the bed, but then returned to whip the man. She made strange remarks and verbally humiliated Andrew in every possible way, but he didn't say a word in response. When Max managed to recover from the shock, he shrieked at the top of his voice, "What's going on here, Ella? How could you?" Finally noticing that they were not the only ones in the bedroom, engrossed in the proceedings, the lovers turned around and looked fearfully at whoever had burst into the room. Ella froze in place, unable to move, but then she squealed back just as loudly, "Who the hell are you? How did you get in here?" Max laughed nervously. He glanced at her wife's lover, calling him by name the moment who hadn't said a word, and became even angrier. Reaching forward to jab a finger at the man and shame him, calling him by name the moment he stretched out his arms, he noticed the white robe he was wearing. Suddenly, he remembered that he was in the guise of a doctor. His face twisted into an angry grimace, and he shouted desperately, "Keep looking at Andrew. Andrew, what are you doing?" He yelled. "I'm going to tell my wife everything." Ella's lover opened his mouth in surprise, but he couldn't get a single word out. Ella decided to answer for him. She squinted her eyes and cautiously took a step towards her husband. "Max, is that you?" she asked quietly, with audible fear in her voice. "No, it's Santa Claus," he chuckled nervously, clasping his hands together. 25 years of marriage, Ella. 25 years. Don't you recognize my voice? She waved her hands in response, as if denying everything that had happened. No, no, she screamed, with tears in her eyes. He made a wide gesture. Max, no. It's not what you think. Yes, what is it? With sarcasm in his voice, he made a wide gesture with his hands. His face was probably sweating, while the makeup was starting to drip. He forcefully threw the doctor's briefcase to the floor that he had been holding all this time and desperately screamed, 25 years of marriage, and this is the gift you have prepared for me, you prostitute. She spun around in Ed. She replied, having returned the voice to its former power, you misunderstood everything. Are you talking to me? He asked, also chuckling nervously. Save that commanding tone for your lover. He apparently likes it. I loved you, I trusted you, I thought you were my soulmate, and you are. Calm down, please, she answered him sternly. Don't say those words that you might regret later. In response, Max clenched his fist with force, his heart pounded, and his eyes became a red whitewash. You dare to tell me what to do, he said, through gritted teeth. You're such an dashed. Seeing the squabble between the spouses, Andrew finally managed to squeeze out a few words. I didn't mean to, it wasn't me. Let go of my hands. His voice sounded strangled, lost. It was like he could barely move his tongue. Ella threw him a glare of anger and looked at her husband again. Max, I'll explain everything to you, only and repeatedly. At this moment, Ella's lover raised his voice again. As he was tied to the bed all this time, he couldn't even move. He began to twitch his arms weakly and said, Unchain me, mistress. Hearing Andrew's last line, Max lost all composure. What did you call my wife? He asked, approaching the man and rolling up his sleeves. Ella rushed over to her husband. Max, no. It's not his fault, she shouted, holding out her hands to her spouse and trying to stop him. Don't touch me, Max answered her, and suddenly he froze in place. He grabbed his heart with his hand and began to slowly settle on the floor. Max just moaned, Something's wrong, Max. What's wrong with you? Ella cried out in tears. She rushed to her husband lying on the floor and began to examine him, tearing off his robe. Max, are you sick? What's wrong? Are you in pain? Max couldn't answer. Ella rushed to her husband. His body was paralyzed, and his lips were frozen in a contemptuous grimace. He mumbled something unintelligible and passed out. Seeing this, Ella immediately rushed to find her smartphone. Shaking with horror, she called an ambulance. The doctors who arrived were no less shocked than the protagonists of this scene. As they arrived at the scene in a matter of minutes, Ella had no time to clean up and change her clothes. The crew that entered the couple's apartment could hardly contain their laughter when they saw what was happening there. In fact, they could be understood. Before their eyes appeared such a picture, a heavily, very famous deputy dressed in some ridiculous costume tied to the bed, and an inarticulate, absent look on his face. He was looking around the room and at the doctors as if he was unable to understand what had happened. Obviously, he was intoxicated or under the influence of some drugs. There was a very beautiful middle-aged woman stomping around in tears and wringing her hands. She was wearing a light silk robe, but her image did not end there. Her bright makeup and latex black clothes that stuck out from under the robe hinted that there was something indecent going on in the house. On the floor lay a man in a white robe, his face thickly smeared with a streak of neck makeup, and next to him lay a toy doctor's case. If that man was conscious and did not require urgent help, probably the doctor on duty would not hold back and began to go gaga when he saw the heroes of this scene. As it turned out later, Max suffered a stroke. After he was rushed by ambulance to the hospital, the doctor stayed behind to fill out paperwork. While looking intently at Ella, he coughed awkwardly into his fist, drawing the unfortunate woman's attention to himself. When she raised her crying eyes to him, the doctor gently asked, Ella, tell me, couldn't I have seen you before? She glanced fearfully at the doctor and quickly looked away. No, you couldn't, she abruptly replied. The doctor continued, eyeing the woman with apparent interest. Well, I'm sure that's not the case. You're a party planner, aren't you? Don't you work with my husband, Max? Heck, The one we just took to the hospital? There was a quick, cat-like flicker of anger on Ella's face. But so what? So what? Asked the doctor, splashing her hands. This whole situation speaks volumes, the doctor said, folding her arms across her chest. Do you think you have the right to judge us? The doctor's face became serious. Yes, I do, he replied. And I have every right. You probably don't remember, but I do remember. 8 years ago, you performed at my daughter's birthday party, dressed up as a Barbie doll. He interrupted her and said, so what? Don't confuse personal life with work. Or are you saying I didn't do a good job in the role? He shook his head. Ella interrupted the doctor disappointedly. No, did you do well in your role? Very well. But if I had only known what kind of man was having fun playing with our children, I would never have contacted your office. You're perverts. Your husband tries on women's makeup, and you're like this. Is that man in a threesome with you? No, I don't understand that, and I don't want to understand it. And I don't want our children to communicate with people like you. Ella burst into flames. First of all, my husband was wearing makeup, not female makeup as you put it, on his face. In the second place, this is none of your business. Be that as it may, this is our private business, and you have no right to judge us or spread the word about what happened here. The man got angry after her, and you have no right to work with children. Perverts like you should stay quiet and keep your head down, he spat rudely to the side, giving Ella a look of displeasure. She rolled her eyes. As you said, we held a party at your daughter's house 8 years ago. So she's already grown up. Then why do you care? You do your job, and we'll do ours. But you know it's coming. Actually, I have a son growing up. Only recently, my wife suggested that I contact your firm to organize a birthday party for him. But after everything I've seen, we'll never go to you. Yes, please, Ella blurted out, we won't get poorer from one rejection alone. He laughed an evil laugh. No, I won't let you work with children anymore. Yes, you're right. I won't tell the others about what I saw today. But believe me, I'll make it clear to a lot of people that you're not allowed near children. Do whatever you want, organize adult parties, but you're not going anywhere near any more children. I'll take care of that. Ella tried to soften. She knew the doctor was wrong, but she didn't want to argue with him. Doctor, listen to me, please, she said, turning on all her charm. It's been a long time since my husband and I have performed at parties, especially children's parties, with special actors. Yes, what happened today is unseemly here, but believe me, it is not what it seems at first glance. She smiled. Please take care of my husband, and we could give you a good discount for organizing your son's party. Are you trying to bribe me? He got even angrier. Who do you think I am, anyway? Of course, your husband will be taken care of, no matter what. But knowing what happened today, I will not cooperate with your firm for any money. You're perverts, and that says it all, he continued, eyeing the woman with apparent interest. Well, then, why don't we have the party for free? He snorted dismissively. Have a nice day, Ella. You'll get a call later about your husband's condition. With these words, he stood up, looked around defiantly, shook his head, and left the circus house. After Ella closed the door behind him, she was tired. She wiped her face, her heart continued to pound frantically. What will happen now? Her mind was confused. What will happen to our reputation? She thought anxiously. After everything that had happened, there was no way she could regain her calm and cool head. Max, what did he think? She panicked, pulling herself together. The woman went to the bathroom and washed off her makeup and took a quick shower, sending her latex clothes to the far drawer of the closet. Every couple of seconds, she grabbed the phone in her hands, waiting for a call from the hospital. A stroke is a terrible thing. How's my favorite one? She thought anxiously, realizing that she was unlikely to be able to sleep after all that had happened. She decided to get the house in order. The first thing she did was head to the bedroom, and when she stepped inside, she almost jumped with fright. The thing was that in all the commotion, she had forgotten about one of the main players in this whole situation. There, still buckled up in bed, lay Andrew, with a wild look of terror in his eyes. Ella ran over to him, and with a quick movement, she uncuffed him. "I'm sorry," she began to babble. "For God's sake, I'm sorry. I'm so ashamed. I forgot all about you." Andrew swore profusely. When his hands were released, he began to rub his wrists with visible anger, looking at Ella. "What's this all about?" roared he, still stammering a little. "What is the meaning of all this?" Ella opened her mouth to answer, but fatigue came over her with renewed vigor, and she just waved her hand in his direction, freeing his legs from the same fate as his arms. "That means I'm in big trouble now," she said. "What?" Andrew asked, shaking his head. "No, why don't you tell me what kind of circus this was?" Ella released the man, and tired, he flopped down next to her. "What?" "My husband saw something he shouldn't have seen," she answered tiredly, covering her eyes. "Your husband? What did he see? And who were those doctors?" The captive never stopped asking questions. Andrew got up from the bed and, staggering, began to look for his clothes. "What am I wearing?" he asked suddenly. "What is it?" He was visibly nervous and flopped down on the bed next to Ella, unable to stay on his feet any longer. She replied tiredly, "Props. And the husband is mine." "What husband?" "We've been together for 25 years, answered Ella in such a tone as if explaining elementary things to a small child. "He saw us like this and thought I was cheating on him. That's why he had a stroke." The paramedics came. She took a good look at Andrew. "And you're not going to make it home in your condition. You'll sleep here." Still sitting on the bed, he clutched his head. "Doctors, what if they recognized me and I'm in this condition?" he groaned nervously. "Why was your husband also in a robe? Is he a doctor too?" "That I don't know," Ella answered honestly, "but they didn't recognize you." "Don't worry, Andrew. I don't understand anything." He caught an even longer and more unhappy look. "What's all this about, Ella?" he asked. "I don't understand anything either, believe me. But sleep here, and I'll go to the other room. I won't sleep tonight anyway." With these words, she got up from the bed intending to leave, but Andrew managed to grab her arm. "Wait," he began, squeezing her wrists. "The woman in his hands, explain to me already what's going on. I don't remember anything. I only remember how you and I met at the cafe, but I didn't plan anything like that. I'm married. I have a wonderful wife and 3 children, and we're just good acquaintances. I don't understand." Using force, Ella managed to wrestle her arm from his grasp. "I'm not going to explain anything to you," she shouted angrily. "I have enough problems as it is. I knew it wouldn't end well. I shouldn't have taken the damn job." He wanted to shout something back, but she shouted angrily. Suddenly, he grabbed his head. He was silent for a couple of seconds. He asked her a very strange question. "Tell me, did we even have something with you?" A puzzled Andrew asked. Ella only jumped in response and threw one last laugh before the door slammed shut behind her. "You'll have to ask your friends." The last of her phrase remained hanging in the air, increasingly stumping Andrew. Ella wasn't much different in imagination from her husband Max. That's why she decided to prepare a special gift for him on the eve of the milestone. For the past few years, her husband dreamed of buying a new car, but the necessary amount could not be put aside. Then it was necessary to buy one thing, then another. Of course, their family was not poor, but they could not afford such an expensive purchase, and there was no need. Both husband and wife had their own car. The car Max dreamed of, long analyzing, was more of a whim than a necessity. She was his blue dream, so he wasn't in much of a hurry to buy one. Long analyzing, Ella came to the conclusion that a dream car given on their wedding anniversary would be a great gift. Then she faced a new challenge: how to make sure that her husband did not guess about her surprise. The thing is that the family had a common budget, and any large purchase would be immediately noticed by him. Then Ella came up with her own special plan. She decided that she would start earning money secretly from her husband in order to surprise him with her gift and thus thank him for all the wonderful years they had lived together. She thought for a long time about how she could earn money quickly and without thinking too much. In her head, there were different ideas, from private performances at private parties of dubious orientation to the organization of her personal business, but none of these options suited her. Frequent appearances would quickly reveal themselves. After all, the family was very well known in narrow circles, but the sexy pranks business required a lot of free time. In the end, Ella found the perfect way to make money. She took up so-called sexy pranks. Her clients were very rich people, mostly men. They hired Ella to prank a friend or business partner. The idea was that initially, the person for whom the prank was planned was drugged with a light sleeping pill by his friends, and then when this person passed out, he was either brought to Ella, or she herself met with him and brought him to any pre-agreed place. Next, Ella would turn on all her charms and all her acting skills. She would change into her client's costume and put a hidden camera in the corner of the bedroom. Ella behaved in front of the camera like the most real mistress from adult movies. She brilliantly played and caricatured a woman that beats her clients with a whip and every possible way humiliates verbally, using funny phrases and expressions. Of course, there was and could not be any intimacy between her and the victim of the prank. As that man was drugged and lightly sedated, he understood little of what had happened and remembered almost nothing the next day. Vague memories, if any were retained, seemed to be remnants of marvelous dreams. Thus, Ella played the role of mistress on camera, amusingly humiliating her ward. When the desired video was taken, she would call his customer friends and ask them to pick it up. As a rule, all the people who were pranked in this way were very powerful and successful. That's what the joke was about. For example, an important director suddenly saw himself on the video lying at the feet of a powerful woman, which humiliated him in every way. Such a prank paid well, and of course, these videos never went anywhere, remained just a joke for another rich man. Ella made her rules clear before she started working this way: no intimacy and no publicity, as none of the clients then did not want outsiders to know about such a prank. All her activities remained secret, so thanks to a very unusual earnings, Ella almost managed to save up for a gift for Max. After learning that her spouse was going on a trip, she took her last client, Andrew, who was ordered by his friends and was about to head to the car dealership. Who knew her spouse would catch her doing it tomorrow? The dire predictions were confirmed. Max had had a stroke. Ella felt so ashamed that it was entirely her fault. She was so badly tormented by her conscience. After all, Max had no use for that car now, and the only thing she had to worry about was his health and a speedy recovery. And then there was that doctor who threatened to ruin the reputation of their family's business. All in all, Ella was more depressed than ever. After waiting for Max to be allowed to come to the hospital, Ella dropped everything and got into her car. When she was already there and was about to go to the room, she noticed something strange. All those people who got in her way literally did not take their eyes off her. They looked at Ella and shook their heads disapprovingly. Even the girl who worked at the front desk of the hospital gave her a demonstrative cluck of the tongue. A surprise before signing her in as a guest. Ella tried not to pay any attention to the reactions of passers-by. Little did she know what was in their heads. I'm probably just imagining it all. I just got myself worked up, she tried to calm herself. Ella put on shoe covers, threw on a hospital gown over her dress, and went in the direction the not very friendly girl from the reception desk had pointed her. She went to the elevator, pressed the call button, and waited. What was her surprise when her old friend Kate stepped out to meet her. Kate! Ella's expression took on a surprised look. What are you doing here, girlfriend? Did you have someone sick too? Kate, who was also very surprised to see her, shrugged her shoulders irritably. But you could say that. What about you? Did you really come to see Max? What Ella asked incredulously. What do you mean, really? As soon as I had a chance to visit him, I came right away. But how did you know that my Max was lying here that you came to see him? Kate smiled with the corners of her lips. Maybe I did, she answered cryptically. What do you care, Ella? You know, after what you did to Max, I probably don't want to hang out with you anymore, much less be friends with you. Ella froze in bewilderment. She asked rudely and coldly, did what? How do you even know that something happened between us? In response, Katie laughed. My dear, the knowledge of what happened between you two is already almost everyone who's anyone. Ella also asked, everyone? Kate answered without going into details. I've already seen Mike, he's in complete shock too. And Jack came, and Tim. No one expected this from you, no one at all. And I always said you were. She stammered, half a word. Oh, forget it. Mike, my Max's brother? Ella asked in surprise. Jack? Tim? When had they all had time to visit him? The doctors had cleared him just an hour ago. That's what you think, Kate replied proudly, raising her chin. All without detaining me. Come and see what the husband brought her husband to, ignoring the norms of decency. Ella grabbed her friend roughly under the elbow. Wait, she whispered. What are you talking about? How do you know what happened between us? Did Max tell you everything? Why did you all make it to him already? I just got a phone call. And pray tell, what did you mean when you said you were always talking about me? Saying what? Kate tried to wriggle out of Ella's grip, but she couldn't do it. Let go, she shouted. I've said too much already. Ella loosened her grip and let Kate pull away. Go and don't come near my husband again, is that clear? Of course, Ella, Kate replied with a sly grin. Ella stared at her friend for a long time, wondering if they were ever really friends. She managed to pull herself together. Finally, she stepped into the elevator, and as she searched for the room she wanted, she was overcome with doubts. Had we really been this happy all these years? She pondered philosophically. Ella was completely confused in her thoughts. She felt so ashamed in front of Max for everything that had happened, but on the other hand, why had he allowed himself to blab about everything to their mutual acquaintances? Sure, he was offended, but he hadn't even listened to her, had he? And then there's Kate. There was a reason I thought she had her eye on Max, and now this, Ella thought in her heart. When she found the right room, Ella stood in front of it for a long time, hesitating to go inside. When she gathered her strength and opened the front door, the sight of her spouse horrified her. It seemed to her that during the few days he had spent in the hospital, he had not only lost 20 pounds, but had aged 30 years. The right side of his face was paralyzed, her hair seemed to turn gray all at once. Tears welled up in the corners of her eyes, and she began the conversation quietly and with remorse in her voice. Max, please, I'm sorry. Max tried to turn his head hearing her voice. Why did you come here? With an effort, dryly and rudely, he asked. What do you mean, why? Ella was surprised. After all, I am your wife, he looked at her. There was a terrible hatred in his gaze now. The corner of his mouth turned downward, one eyebrow hovered over his eye with a frown. The side of his face that had been paralyzed remained motionless, and his whole look frightened Ella far more than if he'd just been angry. He squeezed out quietly and unemotionally, I hate you, Ella. You've ruined my whole life. Ella rushed over to him to bury her head in his arms and sob, to justify herself, explain everything. But he put his hand up awfully slowly with an effort but very confidently. He gave her another hateful look. He wanted to say something else, but he could not manage the spasm that came over him. Ella looked at her husband in horror and could not stop the tears, her mind was reeling. It's my fault, she slowly, despite his objections, approached him and carefully sat on the edge of the bed. Max, let me at least explain. In response, half of Max's face creased in contempt. Explain what? He finally asked. I didn't cheat, Ella continued to justify herself. It was all just for money, for you, for me, he grinned derisively. I didn't sleep with anyone, Ella continued to justify herself. It was a prank, you know? I was making money out of it so I could buy you an anniversary present. Please believe me. If you want, you can ask Andrew, he'll confirm it. Perverts, Max finally said and stopped talking contemptuously, catching his breath. But I'm telling the truth, Max, Ella pleaded. I've never cheated on you. I would never cheat on you. Please believe me. It's just a way to make money. I would never stop, Max interrupted her abruptly. The corners of his mouth twitched, and his face turned blue. He was just scary to look at. Ella cried bitterly. It wasn't my fault, Max. I didn't mean it, she screamed, unable to bear to see how her husband had changed in a matter of days. I just wanted to earn money for your car. I didn't want you to know about it before. And what difference does it make now what you wanted? Kate, who had been eavesdropping under the door, suddenly burst into the room. You've ruined everything yourself, stupid, hysterically she shouted, pointing a finger with a purple long fingernail right in Ella's face. What kind of car is he going to get now? The doctors don't know if he'll ever walk again. Ella couldn't fight back, she was really hysterical. After another minute, the door to the room opened, and a very disgruntled nurse appeared on the threshold and ordered everyone to leave the room. What are you doing here? She was indignant. Do you want to bring the man to a stroke again? He cannot worry. Get out of here, both of you. I'll tell the doctor, and don't ever set foot here again. Out in the corridor, Ella sank down on the couch. She took a sedative out of her purse and drank it. A few minutes later, when the medicine had taken effect, she had a great idea. She would write a letter to her husband, he would read it and understand. Of course, my darling Max, she began scratching hastily on a sheet of paper she had borrowed from the registrar's office. I didn't cheat on you. I realize you may not believe me, but it's true, as if to confirm her words, she nodded confidently. It's a line on my lap. If you want to, you can find out. There's my work profile on the internet, it says it all. It says I'm married, and there can be no intimacy with me. I'm sorry that doctor turned out to be our client, but what can be changed now? In fact, he shouldn't have said anything about what he saw in our house, he could be sued for that. It's doctor-patient confidentiality. Max, honey, you and I are going to be just fine. The money I saved for the car, I'm going to put it all into your treatment, and you're going to be fine. Please, I'm sorry. Today is our anniversary, 25 years of marriage. I wish today is our anniversary, another thing Max muttered as he read the message passed through the staff. I don't believe you, Ella. I'll be filing for divorce. Ella raised her head to the nurse and looked at her fearfully. What did you say? Passed it on like that? It couldn't be, she was almost screaming. Calm down, the clinic worker said sternly. There's no need to get hysterical here. I shouldn't have passed any notes to the stroke patient in the first place. Go away, please, you'll come back when you've calmed down, and when the doctor authorizes a date. It took a week and a half for the doctor to authorize those visits, and that's when Ella had already cut off all the phones and finally met the head doctor of the clinic in person. Hi, she tried to pull herself together and smiled happily at her husband, hoping that he had already changed his anger into mercy. Max, how are you? How are you worried? I hope you're better, the doctor said. I'd feel better if you left immediately. We're getting a divorce, don't you get it yet? Her husband interrupted her harshly. He looked a little better, and he was still speaking with effort, but much more clearly. Most likely, it helped those terribly expensive drugs that Ella had bought on the doctor's recommendation, which she had bought with great difficulty. Ella, not believing her ears, jumped to her feet and began to frantically rush around the room. I can't believe my ears. It's not your words, she stopped abruptly. Wait, I totally forgot to ask you, what was Kate doing here? She said you already had a brother and Jack and Tim. Why did they tell me at the beginning of the hospitalization that it took 3 days to finally see you? Was I being lied to? But why? Max looked at his wife, but now more with consternation than judgment. I had no one, he answered. You must have gotten something mixed up. I had no one. Didn't you mixed up? but I saw Kate with my own eyes. I couldn't have gotten anything mixed up. I talked to her before I came to you. What are you hiding from me, Max? Maybe you're the one who cheated on me, Max laughed weakly. Don't try to put this on me. Don't even try. He tried to get up from the bunk, but the sharp pain made him hard slump back down. He groaned and pressed a button on the edge of his bed. A few seconds later, a nurse showed up in the room and kicked Ella out again, accusing her of giving her husband another seizure. Ella had to leave the hospital again as the nurse circled around the patient, adjusting the machines that were connected to his body. There was only one thought going through his mind: I think she's starting to figure it out. That afternoon, Ella returned home in tears. She was met at the door by her younger sisters, with all their looks showing how displeased they were. As it turned out, Kate was right, and about that incident. As it turned out, that quarreled the spouses and really already knew almost everyone. Ella justified herself to her sisters for a long time, trying to explain to them how it really was. Later, she began to call all sorts of friends and acquaintances, asking about what happened to them. The next few months became a living hell for Ella. Their entire business fell on her fragile shoulders. The media began to leak nasty rumors that the owners of a successful business were not who they claimed to be. Max was only getting worse. All the money that Ella had saved for a gift she invested in his treatment, and even the savings that the couple put aside together, it all went to cure Max. She was literally drowning in her own problems. Their business was already demanding a lot of attention, and then there was her husband's illness. Journalists were always waiting outside her house to ask her uncomfortable questions. Parents who wanted to organize holidays for their children massively refused the services of their firm, not wanting to return the money spent on them. Their business was already acquaintances, literally did not give passage, asking about what had happened. It seemed that everyone around was going crazy every day. Ella persistently drove to the hospital to her husband, and every day she had to explain to the public one and the same thing, as if in a terrible Groundhog Day. Just when she thought she couldn't take it anymore, a miracle happened. Max went on the mend. Ella was just beyond happy. All the effort and money she had invested in treatment had been spent for a reason. He was getting better and better. He could walk on his own. His normal speech came back to him. Although he remained in the rehabilitation clinic for many months, he was gradually returning to his former normal life. More and more often satisfied friends and relatives jostled in his room. More and more often he was smiling. Ella continued to pay for a separate room in a special rehabilitation center. Although these expenses hit her pocket hard, she was glad that her husband was getting better. As time went on, the problem slowly dissipated, and even the media that was going crazy at first began to forget what had happened, switching to more relevant and topical news. Of course, the children's parents did not forget about the shocking information. In the opinion of many, Max and Ella were now, in their eyes, dirty perverts. However, their firm began to receive many more orders for other, more adult holidays. In general, life was beginning to get better. But Ella, in turn, did not get better. Of course, the financial situation of the family has improved, and her husband almost recovered, but the feeling of loneliness and longing did not leave the poor woman. More and more often, she thought about what is real happiness. More and more often, her conscience kept her awake. She kept blaming herself for what had happened. She kept wondering if they were really happy. Of course, to all their many friends and acquaintances, Max and Ella had always been simply the standard of marital well-being. However, after all those, was that really true? Margot did not know the answer to this question. After all those 25 years of their life together, they had never been alone with each other. Always parties, always fun, always a house full of guests. When was the last time they were alone together, just the two of them? Alone together, Ella couldn't remember. More and more often, she thought that maybe there was no love left in their relationship, but only habit and common life. There were also a few questions on her mind. The first of them, of course, was Kate. Why had she been acting like this lately? Did she really have her eye on Max? Also, Ella wasn't quite sure why her husband had dressed up as a doctor on the day it all happened. Although a lot of time had passed since that day, They had never had time to discuss this moment. All in all, Ella suffered a lot. People might have judged her, like she's got everything and she's crazy and money, and a lot of people might her husband, what's wrong with her, but none of them had ever been in her shoes. Every day, her moral state was getting worse. Every new day, she started with tears in her eyes. A little more time passed, and finally, Max was discharged. Although the day of his discharge was planned for a little later, Ella arrived at the hospital early to talk about everything. She got out of her car and quickly looked around, though there were many people around her, and few paid attention to her, realizing that many people had already forgotten about the scandal that had long haunted their family. She exhaled a sigh of relief and headed to the hospital. After checking in at the reception desk, she threw on a robe and went up to the right floor. When Ella entered the room, she thought that she had made a mistake with the room, but there was a strong odor of light women's too sweet perfume in the room. Balloons hung from the ceiling. In the corner of the room, there was a table. In the middle of the room, there was a bottle of champagne on it, and the aura of the room looked more like a nightclub than a hospital. Ella blinked several times, trying to regain her mental clarity, and only then noticed her husband standing opposite the window, saying on his cell phone about something, not even noticing that someone had entered the room. Ella gasped. Max exclaimed, "What's going on here?" She took a quick step toward him and put her hand on his shoulder, forcing him to turn around. Max flinched, noticing his wife, and quickly dropped the call, hiding the phone under his clothes. "Ella, why are you scaring me like this?" He was indignant. "You want to give me another stroke, don't you?" She ignored her husband's barbs. She pointed at the bottle of champagne and asked in a disgruntled tone, "Did you drink alcohol?" "You're out of your mind. You can't drink." "Where were the doctors?" He took a step to the side, moving away from his wife a little further. "What do you care?" he snapped at her. "I want it, and I drink it." Ella felt a prick in her heart and put her hand on his chest. "What are you talking about?" "You can't drink, Max. You can't drink at all." Max laughed easily. "Don't act like you're worried about me. If it wasn't for you, this whole thing wouldn't be happening at all." He wrapped his arms around the room. "Don't bother me. Why are you here?" But Ella wasn't going to calm down. "Do the doctors let you drink?" "Why?" "I only pay money." She rolled her eyes and wanted to leave the room. "I'll go talk to them." "You can't do that." She was indignant, leaving, but Max managed to grab her under the arm. "I wasn't drinking. I didn't drink." He started to justify himself. "The bottle wasn't mine. I had guests." "Guests?" She looked at her husband incredulously. "What kind of guests? Are you sure you haven't been drinking?" "Get some rest." Max also rolled his eyes, but still did as he was asked. "Ella, give it a rest. I'm not an idiot. My health is more important to me." Ella inhaled a sniff and exhaled heavily as well. "Good," she said quietly. "Thank God. But who's been drinking champagne around here?" "That smell in your room smells like women's perfume." "Max, who came to see you?" Max was silent for a few seconds, which seemed to his wife a real eternity. Then he answered confidently and clearly, proudly raising his chin, "Your sister." Ella laughed. "What are you talking about, Max?" "No Polly, no Sophie. You don't just drink in broad daylight, especially not in your room. You asked me what you wanted. I said, what more do you want?" He exhaled tiredly and returned to his bunk, sitting on its edge. "You're here to drive me crazy, aren't you? One stroke wasn't enough for you. You want to finish me off. You're just waiting for me to die." Ella froze in place. She stared at her husband's face for a long time, and the only thought in her mind was, "Who the hell are you? I don't recognize you." Even though Max was back to his old form, and his shaved hair was starting to grow back, it was like he wasn't the same person Ella had once loved. Everything seemed the same, but now it was like he was someone else entirely, someone unfamiliar, rude. Ella had the impression that his body remained the same, but his soul was completely different. She looked into his eyes for a long time, unable to find the right words to answer him. She finally said quietly and with pain in her voice, "What are you saying, Max? What aren't you?" Caustically, her spouse answered her, "The only reason you have brought me to this state is that you want me to die soon. I can't find any other reason." Tears of resentment came to her eyes. "What are you talking about? I've invested all my money in your treatment. I'm paying for the best clinic in this city, and you wouldn't have paid for it. Max spat out the words, don't forget it's not your money, it's our money. After all, we have business in common, and in general, I seriously think that I will file for divorce. Ella froze in place again. She wished she could cry again. She wanted to grab him by the chest and scream at the top of her lungs. For what? But she pulled herself together, suddenly calm. Do you want a divorce? She squinted. What do you want? By all means. But as you remember, according to our prenuptial agreement, I'll keep the whole business for you. Max snapped at her, but immediately thought about it, with a frown on his brow. Max and Ella had gotten married quite early, when they were still students, but they still had a prenup. They had entered into it after several years of living together. It was at the moment when their business began to bring in a good income. The contract stipulated that if one of the spouses suddenly decided to divorce, and the other was against it, the entire business should go to the latter. This rule was written down in case one of the spouses cheated on the other. In such a case, the cheater was to be left with nothing. Several other rules were also provided for. If one of the spouses presented evidence of the other's cheating, the entire business would go to the one who had been cheated on. There was a third option, in case both spouses agreed to a divorce. In that case, the business would be divided in half, and the divorce would take place on a parity basis. But at that moment when the contract was concluded, neither Ella nor Max did not think seriously that all this would ever happen. Ella gave her husband an arrogant look. Yeah, well, what did you think? Decided to get a divorce for no good reason? Let's go. He jumped to his feet. No good reason, Ella. You almost drove me into a coffin. Isn't that a good reason? And you're the one who cheated on me. Our contract says I'm supposed to take over the business. She laughed, seeing how nervous Max was. I didn't cheat on you, she said back. That's easy to prove. And how would you prove it? Prove it? Asked your lover. He'd be in on it with you. We could ask him. I'll also show you my work profile that says everything you've seen isn't true. I also have a lot of videos that show that I'm only an actress. I have never cheated on myself and can easily prove it. But why did you decide to get divorced? That's another question. Keep in mind, I'm not just going to give you a divorce. So, it's up to you. If you want a divorce, you'll lose everything. Max froze in place, but then he screamed at the top of his voice, how did you get me? He started thrashing around, kicking everything in his path. You cheated on me. You cheated on me. You should be the one without everything, not me. Ella watched Max's tantrum with tears in her eyes. It hurt her to watch him change. It hurt her to watch the way he acted. She walked over to him and put her hands on his cheek. Please, calm down, she said quietly. You shouldn't be nervous after a stroke. Pull yourself together. He sharply withdrew her hand and turned back to the window, turned away. Why did you come, Ella? You've already driven me to it. That's all you need. Then go away, she answered quietly. No, Max. I just wanted to talk to you about what? About us? About our future? I realize you hate me right now. How can I change that? She approached him from behind and wanted to put her hand on his shoulder, but didn't dare to do so. I love you. I won't give you a divorce. Not because I want to put you out of business, but because I love you and I want to be with you, she said quietly and with conviction. I loved you, Ella, Max replied, half silent. Go, you have nothing more to do here. We'll meet later, and then we'll talk. Ella couldn't find the right words to answer. She left his room in silence. When she visited her husband, she hoped that she could get some support from him. She hoped that he could find the right words that he would finally forgive her, or at least tell her that he loved her. But that conversation only made her feel worse. She left the hospital and sat in her car, trying to calm her racing heart. As she started the car and was about to drive home, a car caught her eye. The car was familiar to her. A woman in a luxurious dress got out of the red car. It perfectly matched the color of the car. And in her hands, she was carrying a small handbag, and on her feet were high heels. Ella opened her mouth in surprise. "Kate? What are you doing here?" she thought to herself. She sat in the car, watching her former friend's actions. "Maybe she's just parked here and will go somewhere else," she thought to herself. But her suspicions were confirmed, and Kate walked into the hospital. Thinking briefly, Ella decided on a ruse to sneak into the clinic unnoticed and follow where her classmate would go. After waiting for Kate to go inside, Ella counted down a couple of minutes and hurried after her, slipping a few bills to the girl at the front desk. She thus concealed her presence in the hospital, hurried toward Max's room. She approached quietly, stealthily, so that she could not be heard. Luckily, she found that the door to the room remained open, and Ella discreetly stopped nearby, wanting to overhear the conversation between her husband and her ex-girlfriend. Although Ella couldn't see what was going on, she tried to make out by the sounds what was going on in there. The rustling sound of clothing hinted that they were hugging there, or maybe not. Starting to guess, scared, Ella covered her mouth with her hand, listening to every rustle. Whether they were hugging or not, she didn't know, but after many minutes, they finally started talking. "What a beautiful woman you are," Max said with audible admiration, turning around. He was silent for a moment. "Beautiful. That dress suits you so well, thank you, honey," Kate answered him, and from the timbre of her voice, I could tell she was smiling. "I bought this dress especially for you." "How are you?" she asked. "I hope you're feeling better." "You've had that chicken, Ella?" Max asked idly. "Yes, I did, but she just left a while ago." "God, I'm so sick of her," Kate laughed. "We'll be rid of her soon," she said. Hearing Kate's last words, Ella squeezed her palm even tighter, moaning with resentment. She tried to control herself, not wanting to give away her presence and ignoring the tears that flowed from her eyes. She continued to listen to their dialogue. "Kate, I'm afraid it's not that simple," he said sullenly. "We were just talking about divorce, and I don't think there's any way we're going to get her out." "What do you mean?" "There's no way," she sounded disappointed. "No, you try. And don't forget, you're the reason I divorced my husband because of me," he laughed warmly, "but don't blame me." "It wasn't my fault." "Whose fault was it?" she asked. "He caught us together. He realized I had a lover and filed for divorce. Who's to blame if not you?" "Well, you, for one," Max replied. "You're the one who decided to cheat, and you didn't," she laughed. "You're as much of a cheater as I am." "But okay, what's going on with that chicken?" "Tell me anyway." "When she came, I told her I'd file for divorce, and she remembered about the prenup, and it's really not possible to deprive her of her share in the business. I mean, she really didn't cheat on me, and there's no proof that she did." I could hear Kate frowning. "But what about our last plan? Should we try that?" "You mean the day I dressed up like a doctor to put on makeup?" "Oh, I don't know, Kate. I'm afraid that plan won't work anymore." "Why not?" she asked. "But why?" "Why? Why?" "I had planned that I would change my appearance and film Ella and I having intimacy. That would be proof that she had allegedly cheated on me. And now I'm not sure we're ever going to get back together again. And she'll start asking questions if I decide to be a different person again. I don't know what to do with you." "I really don't know," he said wistfully and sadly. "All we can do is get her to agree to the divorce. That way, we can split our business in half, and we can go our separate ways. Give half your business to that cheapskate." "But no way," Kate shouted back irritably. Then there was a distinctive sound from which you could understand that she tapped her heel on the floor. "We need the whole business. I don't know how, but solve this issue quickly." Ella stood next to the door and couldn't believe everything she'd heard. It turned out that Kate and Max had been lovers for years. Max was the reason she divorced her last husband, and she told me they were at odds. What a... Ella thought. She stood by the door, unable to move. Everything I cared about was wrong. Max was trying to set me up. He fell out of love with me a long time ago, she thought. She couldn't bring herself to go inside, to make a scandal, and she couldn't bring herself to leave. She continued to listen in, but the couple had fallen silent. Judging by the distinctive sounds, Max was kissing Kate. Ella felt sick to her stomach, her head spun, and she felt herself starting to faint. Unable to listen to her spouse cheating on her literally through the door, she quickly turned around and staggered away without saying anything to anyone. That night, Ella couldn't find her place. She thrashed around the house, trying to find somewhere to put herself, but every inch of her husband's apartment reminded her of him. She couldn't sleep that night. When the sun rose and life began to awaken in the streets of the city, Ella realized she couldn't go on like this. It was time for a change. At first, she wanted to go straight to the hospital to see Max. She wanted to ask him why he'd done what he'd done. She wanted to look into his eyes and see the remorse in them. But later, she changed her mind about going to him. She decided to wait until he was discharged. And there, Ella planned to make a real show of it. After all, it was expected that Kate would come to the discharge. But after hours of thinking, she realized that she shouldn't do that either. Starting to think soberly, Ella was able to realize her advantage. She knew about Max and Kate's love affair, and they knew that she was aware of it. She didn't realize that this fact could be exploited. All she had to do was get proof of her husband's infidelity. She decided to act, but soon realized that she had no energy left for this revenge. The events of the previous months had sucked all the juices out of her. She realized that she wouldn't be able to deal with Max and his mistress properly without telling anyone. The day Max was scheduled to be discharged, Ella decided she needed a vacation. Spitting on everything and telling herself to take it as it comes, she bought a hot trip to another country and flew off to recover a little and think about her next steps. Ella landed in the Philippines. Checking into a hotel, she spent the first few days inside the room. The same questions never wanted to leave her mind. Did he really never love me? Was he really going to set me up like this? She was driving herself crazy, thinking about the events of the past few days. She didn't want to believe that Max was capable of cheating, that he was willing to slander her, and, more importantly, with whom? With their mutual friend Kate? Ella couldn't, more importantly, she didn't even want to believe what had happened. Day after day, she was reminded more and more of the events of the past. She thought about Max, about Kate, about everyone they'd ever gone to school with. How long had Kate been in love with Max? How long had their relationship lasted behind her back? She didn't have an answer to those questions, but now that everything was out in the open, a lot of things were starting to fall into place. And the way Kate had behaved back during their studies and all her smooth phrases towards Ella. Ella tortured herself with these thoughts. She literally did not let herself breathe quietly. The moment she began to speculate about Kate's daughter, namely, that the girl was so much like Max, she suddenly realized that she couldn't go on like this. Margaret finally pulled herself together and left the room to distract herself and enjoy the local beauty to the fullest. The first thing she did was head towards the sea. She wanted to breathe in the illuminating scent of the sea. She wanted to forget about everything. She lazily amused herself on the white sand, letting the sun's rays envelop her body. In this position, Ella spent almost all her day, sometimes moving into the shade. And at the moment when she was about to leave back to her room, she was suddenly called out by a rough male voice. She turned around and gasped. A tall, muscular young man was striding confidently toward her. His skin shone in the rays of the departing sun, and his muscles played every time he took a step. As he stepped closer to her, she lifted her head up in fascination, trying to look into his eyes, which seemed the color of the sea, blue, deep, a serene ocean seemed to splash in them. He smiled broadly at the woman, revealing his flawless smile. "Do you speak Russian?" he asked. "What?" "Yes, a little." Too embarrassed by the surprise, Ella replied. She continued to admire this man and forgot about everything in the world. The man smiled even wider. "It is so good to hear the native speech." He took her hand in his and kissed her wrist as a greeting. "Don't get me wrong, it's just that I'm so glad to meet you. I realized from afar that we are compatriots." Ella laughed with a toss of her head. "How did you realize that?" "Well," he laughed slightly after her, "after all, our Russian women are the most beautiful in the world." And you, he was embarrassed. Oh, I'm sorry. Anyway, I'm very glad to meet you. I'm Alex, and you? Ella, she smiled warmly. Nice to meet you too. I must admit, I didn't realize you were Russian. You're so tanned and so. No, I realized you weren't Filipino. They're all short. But I didn't expect you to be Russian too, the man smiled. Yes, I know what you mean. It's just that I've been living in the islands for 5 years now. Of course, I'm tanned, and my work forces me to have a hearty body. That's why I probably look very different. Ella looked at the man with interest, then tilted her head to the side. What do you do for a living? She asked. Are you an athlete? Well, you could say that. I'm a lifeguard who works on this beach. I also teach surfing and do a lot of other things. And you, he smiled slightly, what do you do? I bet you're an athlete too. She was completely embarrassed. How did you figure that out? She asked. No, I'm not an athlete. I used to be a gymnast, but that's in the past. Now I'm an entrepreneur. Well, gymnast, I was close. An entrepreneur? What's your business? And why did you give up sports? You have to shine. I never have, she waved her hands. I graduated from circus school, then my husband and I started organizing parties. So, I've never seen any great athletic or circus success. I'm sorry, are you married? He was visibly upset. But where's your husband? You know, I graduated from circus school too. That's how a meeting is fate, Ella laughed, and your husband, consider us divorced. Our marriage is over. Alex's face brightened with a smile. I'm sorry to be happy about your divorce, but I just can't help myself. If you're free, can I take you out this evening? I would so much like to talk to a native, almost man in Russian. He stretched out, almost pitifully, and adjusted such a nice face that Ella involuntarily smiled. But then she thought hard. Of course, I like this young man, but he was so young. I'm not sure I should have any kind of relationship with him, she asked carefully, so as not to offend him. Alex, I'm sorry, how old are you? He frowned. I'll answer, of course, but why do you ask? Are you afraid I'll be too old for you? Ella laughed again. Yes, I am. I'm almost 45. What about you? What are you talking about? That's why I'm wondering. Am I too old for you? Alex's eyes widened in surprise. 45? I don't believe it, he laughed. And you look 25, no more. Ella shook her head. But don't exaggerate, you young people think 40 is old. In fact, it's far from it. No way, it doesn't seem that way to me. I'm personally 38, so don't worry about age. You and I are perfectly compatible, he smiled. Well then, I'd be happy to spend time with you, he smiled following her. Then they went. Alex and Ella spent a lovely evening together. Since her new acquaintance had been living in the Philippines for years, he knew many interesting places. Ella was glad to have this acquaintance. It seemed to her that this was exactly what she needed now. As it turned out later, Alex was from the same city as Ella and even studied in the same school as her, but a few years later. From the day they met, they saw each other daily. Alex persuaded Ella to come to his surfing lessons, and she began to learn this difficult skill. Of course, she was not able to stand on a board in the sea right away. However, her excellent physical preparation and weekly trainings were not in vain, and she learned literally on the fly. It turned out that Alex had also dreamed of performing in the arena after graduation. He even managed to work in a traveling circus, but such an unsettled life quickly bored him. Then he took up surfing. True, away from the seas and oceans, he learned on artificial waves in a special center. Then he became a coach and then moved to the Philippines. In general, his life turned out to be interesting and even confusing. He was not only handsome and strong but also well-educated and smart. Ella didn't even notice that he was younger than her. They continued to communicate, but no romantic relationship happened between them. She immediately dotted all the I's, explaining that now was not the best time for her to start new relationships. That day, when Ella was about to get ready to go home, Alex offered her an interesting case. He knew a Russian-speaking tour guide who conducted excursions to the islands of the nearby archipelago. Ella agreed because such entertainment was quite up to her. When the boat was about to leave, Alex told her with great regret that he would not be able to go with her because of some work difficulties. But he insisted that she go alone. Shrugging her shoulders, Ella agreed, arranging to meet after the excursion. He accompanied her and personally put her on board. The ship was small. The friendly guide with a beaming smile introduced all the passengers of the boat to each other, and together they set off. Not as many people went along with Ella as she had expected, a family consisting of a girl of about 8 years old, dad, and mom, some young couple, and actually Margot herself. At first, she was skeptical about this excursion, but then seeing the expanse of the Philippine Sea in front of her, she couldn't believe that it was all real and not just a picture that stood on the screensaver of her computer desktop. Those islands that could be seen in the distance were simply mesmerizing, and the azure color of the water beckoned, not giving to take her eyes away. Rainbow tropical fish swam past, scared part from the boat. Sober shoals, the shore was getting farther away, as if they were shrinking in size. And only now Ella seemed to realize how small and insignificant all her problems were in relation to the vast world. The dense vegetation of the nearest island, on which the boat had kept its way, enlivened her view, and Ella had time to think that the place was somehow magical, as if alive. She saw turtles swim past the huge and majestic tall palm trees that grew on the island like lighthouses. It seemed that they were bound to be somehow special and magical, that it was from them that the island spirits watched over those who set foot on their sacred land. Ella thought about the tribes that lived on some of these islands. She wondered if they had similar problems, if the natives suffered from adultery, if they had access to the torment of conscience, if they worried about relationships in their family, about the little things in life. Thinking about these things helped Ella, they made her morale better. After all, is it so important what happens in one small family when there is a huge magical world around? When this world is so beautiful and diverse? When fancy and colorful fish swim by, the sea breeze blows in your face, and beautiful flowers grow somewhere in the distance. Ella realized that all problems can be solved. All that was important was to take a breath and look around carefully. When she finished with her own reflections and decided to enjoy the tour to the fullest, she felt that something strange was happening. It seemed to her that it was as if the surroundings had darkened and the rays of the sun, which just 5 minutes ago had been enveloping her body, had stopped warming her. She raised her head, and the first thing she noticed was a large flock of some unusual birds, unknown to her before. Those birds, as if sensing something, quickly scurried away with all their appearance, making it clear that something bad was happening. When Ella threw her head even higher and noticed that the once blue sky began to be covered with dark storm clouds, she looked closely at her boatmates. She saw a look of fear in their eyes. She glanced at the guide, but he looked scared and uncomprehending. All their gazes were directed somewhere behind her. Then, went cold. She decided to turn around, and seeing what the boat passengers were looking at so intently, her heart skipped a couple beats. She turned back around and turned to the tour guide. "What's going on?" Frightened, she asked. The tour guide shifted a devastated look to Ella, his eyes burned with true terror. He began to fidget in one place, not knowing where to stop his gaze. He glanced back at Ella and asked her in passing, "What?" And then he stared back again. He didn't seem to understand what was being asked of him. Ella felt fear begin to fill her entire body. "What's going on?" she asked with pressure. The clouds were closing in on the sky, and the wind seemed to be picking up. "Is it safe to go out to sea in this weather?" She looked at her companion with judgment. "Come on, don't be silent, we have to go back immediately," he smiled guiltily. "No promises of a storm, I didn't know. The weather should be fine, I'm not an idiot. I checked the forecasts, this will pass, now without much certainty," he said. Ella turned again to look once more at the tumultuous purple sky. Behind it was probably only her imagination, but it seemed to her as if screams of terror were coming from the shore. It was getting darker and darker. The wind began to howl terribly in the air, as if by magic. Things were flying, garbage, personal belongings of the tourists, some debris, as if they had been driven from the shore by a hurricane. Ella shouted, not remembering herself, "Turn to the island, it's safer there." But it was more like the guide was yelling back. The sailors were yelling. The captain peeled his body on the wheel. It screamed frantically. The words were no longer understandable in the rumble of howling wind. The hurricane played out not at all on a joke. People were literally torn off their clothes, handbags, and everything that was not fixed on board was carried away into the sea. The wind became like a scalding ice. It blew with such force that it was ringing in her ears. A terrible and frightening thought came into Ella's mind. It seemed to be the end. The first exploding and solid blackness of lightning appeared in the sky. The wind was already so strong that it swallowed up both the screams and, in general, everything around. The little girl who sat quite near her in fear clutched at her father's arm, shouting something desperately, but her voice could not be heard. Her mother waved her arms in terror, shouting something to her husband. She had a look of genuine fear on her face. The only words she could make out were the words of the guy sitting next to Ella, in a voice that was wild, even animalistic, and screaming in English, sparing his throat, "We're all going to die, life jackets." And now the heavy drops of the tropical downpour drummed on the sea surface, and the first terrible waves began to rise up. A real tsunami was on the move. The color scheme of local beauties changed in a flash. Now everything was no longer blue, green, and serenely bright. The world was at once dark, frightening, and deadly. The first huge wave, to their delight, passed somewhere in the distance. Ella watched the frantic speed at which it raced toward the shore, as if intent on killing all life. The wind howled, lightning flashed, illuminating the horror on the faces. The helmsman, as it turned out, did not know how to handle the boat at all. Seeing him trying ineffectually to steer her toward the not-too-distant shore of the island, Ella got up from her seat and tried to approach him. She grasped the side and almost crawled forward, centimeter by centimeter. Finally, with a single tug, she stood up, and at once, she grabbed the helm and almost went overboard. It was impossible to level the course. The natural elements were much stronger than human efforts. She gestured with her hand and shouted to the young boy and the father of the little girl, though shouting was almost useless. "Everyone, over here, help level the helm." But no one responded to her call. The boy seemed to have lost his mind over everything that was happening, and the father clutched his family tightly in his arms. Ella tried to do something, but the hurricane that attacked the defenseless tourists was stronger. At some point, she realized that she was no longer trying to fight the course of their shaking boat. She realized that she had only grabbed the helm to keep from being swept into the water by the wind. Everyone squealed, but it was as if there was no sound, and the faces in the lightning were whiter than chalk and full of terror. At the moment when it seemed to Ella that it was still possible to escape, she saw something terrible from far away. A tremendous wave was coming at them. Of course, she could not estimate its full scale, but it seemed to her that this wave was the size of a big city house. Ella, wet to the skin with her last strength, clung to the steering wheel and stared at her death in horror, as if mesmerized. Then, her gaze for a moment torn from the nightmarish spectacle met the gaze of the tour guide. She realized there was no chance. All the passengers on the boat could only watch in horror at the inevitable end. The moment the wave came closer, it covered the entire horizon with itself. The force that the element was capable of only once raged. The wave at once covered the small boat. The bottom of the vessel cracked in half, and they all ended up, God knows where. Ella didn't remember what happened next. She probably wouldn't ever want to remember. All she remembered was the clammy fear that coiled her entire being from the inside out. She remembered the unthinkable horror that had settled in her soul. The seawater was merciless. It filled everything, trying to penetrate to the very depths of her lungs. Her eyes thought the air was running out. The moment she realized that she could not survive and accepted her imminent death, a voice came from somewhere far away. Seeing and understanding almost nothing, she turned around. There in the distance was a child, the same girl who had gone on that gruesome excursion with Ella. Then, as Ella thought back to that moment, it seemed to her that she wouldn't have heard her voice under those conditions. Thunder and lightning filled the entire space. The wind howled as if it were a wild beast and hurt her body. The rain drowned everything out, but she still heard that girl's voice. Ella often thought later that the voice came to her from inside her own head, not from the raging sea. When Ella saw that the child was in danger, Ella did her best to save him. She, despite the terrible pain in her whole body, swam in the direction from which the terrible child's cry was heard. And in a few seconds, a small immobilized body hung on her neck. At the moment when the little girl noticed the approaching help, she lost consciousness. Ella herself didn't remember how she managed to swim out. Maybe it was due to her good physical fitness, or maybe the main spirits had helped her, or was she lucky and they were swept ashore by the waves. Either way, those two were the only ones who had managed to escape. Ella opened her eyes. She didn't immediately realize where she was. Her head was splitting, every muscle aching. She couldn't even realize the magnitude of what had happened. It seemed to her that it had all been a dream. Gathering her strength, she got up from her seat and sat up. The first thing that caught her eye was the bright blue sky. It seemed as if nothing terrible had happened. It was just a dream. Ella thought for a second, but what she noticed next told a different story. The wreckage of what was probably the boat she had sailed on was lying around her, thick palm trunks floating in the muddy waves. Somewhere in the distance, in the nearly calm sea, numerous dark objects could be seen. Ella shuddered as she imagined what those vague shapes might be. Somewhere she spotted a ship's hull, broken in half. There was some sort of cloth dangling from a tall surviving palm. She got to her feet, examined her own body. All of her legs were bruised and abraded, and every bone in her body was aching. The entire shore she had woken up on was covered in the debris of other people's lives, left as such an insignificant reminder of herself. To her delight, she spotted a bag somewhere in the distance. As she approached, she picked it up, held it in her hands, and began to look through it carefully. The bag was torn in places, soaked with salty seawater, but the contents were thankfully not completely gone. She opened the bag, and when she saw the bottle of drinking water, she realized she was simply dying of thirst. Taking a couple of big gulps, she suddenly froze in place. The events of the storm flashed into her memory, and she began to remember how much she would have liked to drain the entire bottle. She managed to force herself to stop, leaving about half in it, and began to look around carefully. She was reminded of the girl she thought Ella had managed to save. She tucked the water back into her bag and hung it on her shoulder once more. She looked around, only now she noticed that she was on a small island, an island that was unfamiliar to her. A wild fear enveloped her. Who knew who or what was on this island? She swallowed hard but took the first step, heading deep into the thicket. There could be a small and frightened little girl somewhere. Ella gathered her strength and screamed as hard as she could, "A girl! Girl!" She called, the little girl Ella had rescued sometime later. To her incredible joy, she heard a rustling somewhere in the tall bushes. "Sweet girl, is that you?" she cautiously called out. For a split second, the rustling stopped, but then a little face emerged from the bushes, a frightened face full of fear. "Everyone's in daycare." "Where's Mommy?" the little girl asked quietly and pitifully. "Where's Daddy? I can't find them." Tears came to Ella's eyes. As much as she wanted to go back, the likelihood of this little girl's parents surviving the storm was very slim. She shook her head, trying to push the wistful thoughts away, and tried to smile so as not to scare the girl. "I haven't seen them yet. Let's try to find them together." With these words, Ella stretched out her hand. Without thinking long, the girl nodded and climbed out of the bushes. There was almost nothing left of her clothes. Her hair was loose from the saltwater and the merciless storm. Her legs and arms were visibly shaking. Ella asked, "What were you doing in the bushes, honey? Were you really hiding?" The girl looked fearfully at Ella. "No, but maybe it was just my imagination. I saw some strange people out here." "People?" Ella was visibly frightened but tried not to show it to the child. "Then you did the right thing. By the way, what's your name?" "Name?" I'm Mia. Mia, and who are you? How did you find me? I'm Ella, she smiled broadly. You hid well, I wouldn't have found you on my own. But since I knew you were out there, I tried my best. Luckily, it's just the two of us now. I'm sure we'll be rescued from the world soon. Mia stopped in place, startled. Rescued, she repeated the horrible word. Where are we? What happened? I don't remember much, the little girl said sadly. Ella frowned. We were on the island, Mia. Don't worry, it's just that we got caught in a storm. But luckily, we survived, and now everything will be okay. She took the girl's hand and pulled her along. But we walked towards the shore, into the storm. She took Ella's hand uncertainly. I remember getting into the boat with my parents. They got rescued too, didn't they? They're around here somewhere, aren't they? Of course, smoothing away her tears, Ella answered her. She realized, of course, that such an outcome was unlikely, but she would have liked to believe it. She would like to believe that the storm had not taken human lives. She would like to believe that all the tourists were saved. As they reached the shore, Ella remembered the bag. Deciding to try and distract the girl from thoughts of her parents, she took out a bottle of water. Mia, I forgot, you must be thirsty. Mia stared at the sand-stained water bottle for a long time. But I'm not allowed to drink someone else's. Ella shook her head. You can now, drink it. You'll feel better. She swallowed a lump, coming to her throat. It'll be all right. Mia and Ella, having become friends, spent the next day together. Once again, they cautiously scoured the island. They discovered that they were all alone here. On the one hand, it could not help but be happy that there were no wild tribes on the island. But on the other hand, it meant that it was very unlikely that everyone had escaped. In the 24 hours they had spent on the island, they had managed to feel as the last people on Earth would probably feel. They gathered local fruits to satisfy their oppressive hunger, and Ella even decided to try her hand at fishing. In the bag she found on the shore, she uncovered a small penknife. Finding a thick stick from some tree, she put one end of it on that chow and went hunting to catch fish. Luckily, she managed to do it. There were lots of fish, and it was not so difficult to catch fish with such a sharp stick. Toward evening, when Mia and Ella had finished their search, they settled down on the very shore, with a hopeful look at the horizon of the peaceful sea. Ella had a feeling that fate was favorable to them. Because in her bag, she found also not helping matches. Probably some tourist had anticipated such an outcome of events and had prepared for everything in advance, having packed a survival bag. It's a pity, though, that he didn't need it. Thanks to these matches, as well as the boat wreckage that had fallen ashore, Ella built a fire on it. They managed to roast the fish Ella had caught, wrapping it in palm leaves. After this dinner, when little Mia had fallen asleep, tired from the long day, Ella thought she saw something on the horizon. She jumped to her feet, squinting her eyes. The sun had almost set, and there was little to see, but Ella was sure it wouldn't be long before they were rescued. Without thinking, she rushed to the shore, waving her arms and shouting with all her might, "We're here! We're here!" A dot appeared in the distance. At first, Ella wasn't sure she'd gotten it right. Later, however, as the dot floated closer, she became certain it was a boat and continued to yell as hard as she could, "Help! Help! Save us! We're here!" But apparently, the ship was too far away to hear her screams. As she moved back closer to the fire and under the worried gaze of Mia, who had been awakened by her screams, she began to think hard about what else she could do. Mia stretched sleepily. "Ella, what are you doing?" she asked, yawning. "Why are you screaming like that? Did you see someone? You must have imagined it. We've looked around the island. We're all alone here." Ella kept frowning. "We need something to get their attention." She pointed in the direction the peace boat had gone. There were people there. They could have saved us. The girl rose to her feet, gazed out at the horizon. "Ella," she stretched out, "wouldn't they notice our fire? I think they're already swimming toward us. Are we going to be rescued soon?" With hope in her voice, she asked the bonfire. For sure, Ella rejoiced. And once again, broke away from her seat and ran deep into the thicket. There she instantly picked up a lot of branches and leaves and anything else that could burn, threw it all into the fire, and then added a few green huge leaves to make more smoke. The fire immediately flared up with renewed vigor from the raw leaves really kicked up a column, a clear gray smoke. Ella sat down next to, took Mia's small hand, and began to wait for rescue. Unfortunately, there was nothing more she could do. After a while, her expectations were realized. A small lifeboat docked at the shore, and a sturdy male figure jumped out of it. "How are you? Are you all right?" shouted a low male voice in clear Russian. When the owner of it came closer, Ella was able to make out a familiar face. Alex, she threw herself around his neck. "I knew it. I knew we would be saved." Alex looked around Ella and Mia in surprise. "Ella, who's that?" he exhaled forcefully. "God, I'm so glad you're okay." He pulled her against his chest. "I thought you were." He fell silent without agreement, continuing to hold her tightly against him. "Alex," she said his name again, and she did the same after a couple seconds. She pulled away from him and walked over to Mia, pulling her close to her. "Alex, Mia's parents, where are they?" "They were on that boat with us. I hope they were rescued." Hearing about the girl's parents, Alex visibly darkened. "Mia, yes." He squatted down in front of the little girl. "Come on, I'll take you aboard. We'll talk about your parents later." Mia shrugged her shoulders, not understanding anything. This whole situation had exhausted her so much that she couldn't find the strength for any emotion. Ella walked behind her, and her heart clenched with pain from Alex's look and tone. She realized that the little girl's parents were not alive. Mia and Ella stepped into the lifeboat. On her side, besides them and a couple of lifeguards, there were several other people who had been injured in the storm, just like them. All of the injured were taken to the hospital. As it turned out, little Mia was hurt pretty badly during the storm. She just didn't feel any pain from the shock, so she had to stay in the clinic indefinitely. Ella herself, as it turned out, was far less injured. Aside from a few bruises and horribly sore, bruised ribs, she appeared to have no injuries. After being examined, she was released and sent back to her hotel, to a different one of course. After all, there was almost nothing left of the one she'd been staying in. Ella's heart ached. She had already forgotten about Max and the treacherous traitor, Kate. She felt too sorry for little orphan Mia, hurt for her, not for herself. Luckily for her, Alex was right outside the hospital door. He saw the woman's condition and immediately realized that she needed friendly support. Ella did not want to be alone after all that she had been through, so she invited Alex to her room. She cried on his shoulder for a long time, telling him about her worries. He stroked her head affectionately and promised to do everything he could to help her. After hours of talking, Ella couldn't help herself. Alex was a handsome man, and she snuggled up to him, forgetting everything in a passionate kiss. That night turned out to be the best night of her life. For many years she had been married. She had forgotten what it meant to be in the strong arms of a man who was sincerely attracted to her. But this morning, embarrassed, she asked him to leave her bedroom. Sure, she was attracted to him, but she saw no future with him. She spent the rest of her vacation looking for Mia's relatives. As it turned out, the girl was left all alone. Then, Ella made an insanely important decision. She decided to adopt the unfortunate girl, taking her under her guardianship. Since the girl had no immediate relatives except for her old grandfather, who was almost in senile dementia, Mia was facing the prospect of being in an orphanage. Ella traveled back to her homeland with almost no memory of her old life. She spent a lot of energy and time gathering all the necessary paperwork to adopt Mia. When everything was ready, she went to pick up the girl and took her in temporarily. Ella lived in the apartment that she had once inherited. She never went back to the house she had once lived in with Max. When her life became a little calmer, she realized it was time to get a divorce. But her health left much to be desired. Immediately after her vacation, she put on a lot of weight and began to swell. It was all from stress. Ella decided for herself, gathering all the will in a fist, went to their joint apartment with her husband. During those long months that Ella was away, he didn't even try to seek her out. Their business went downhill. Apparently, after his discharge, Max never thought of returning to work, probably decided that Ella would take care of everything as before. And she was on her way to him with the express purpose of negotiating a divorce and splitting the business in half. She no longer loved the man, she no longer wanted him near her. Max had agreed to the divorce easily and quickly. He finally admitted that his relationship with Kate was over 3 years old. This information Ella took coldly, without much emotion. After all, the experience of betrayal of her husband seemed to her something insignificant and unimportant. They divorced quite quickly because there were no more disputes and divided the property and business. Ella realized that from now on she did not want to do the holidays and sold her share to the side. Then she sold the apartment that she inherited and added to the money that proceeds from the sale of their joint property with her ex-husband. She bought a large country house and put some money in her bank account. She didn't know what she wanted to do in the future and decided to leave that question for later. Ella and Mia moved into their new home and lived happily ever after. However, Ella's problems did not end there. In fact, every day she felt worse and worse since the moment she returned from vacation to her native land. It had been about 3 months, she had gained a lot of weight, and the swelling had not even begun to subside. But the changes in her body did not end there, and she worried about her health. With Mia now in her care, she went to the doctor. Having passed most of the examination, doctors as one sent her to gynecology. In response, Ella only waved them away, and at the suggestion that she might be pregnant, she laughed in their faces. "I'm infertile," she replied, "I can't have children." But the doctors were persistent. What was her amazement when it turned out that she was indeed 11 weeks pregnant. Despite her earlier diagnosis, further pregnancies, after some medication correction, proceeded easily. A few more months passed, her and Mia's life was going smoothly. The girl was transferred to the local school. She was happily engaged in sports, dancing. On one of his parent-teacher conferences, Ella met a guy from Mia's school. "Oh, come on, she's just throwing up her hands." Polly shook her head. "You shouldn't think so, sis. You know everybody had the same opinion about you, that you were free-spirited, wild, irresponsible, and now you've adopted Mia. And now you're waiting for your own baby. Maybe your free-spirited surfer doesn't mind family life at all. Have you thought about it?" "Whatever, but I think you should tell him," Ella said. "Besides, how am I going to find him? Besides, I don't know how I did it. It's a real resort romance, you know? I didn't expect this from myself, but it's all for the best. I can imagine how handsome my son will be." Polly smiled warmly. She was about to say something else, but the bell at the gate interrupted her. Her sister looked at Ella, who looked a little like a hippopotamus. She grinned and rose from her seat. "Sit down, I'll see who's there." Ella smiled gratefully. "Thank you, it's really hard for me to walk anymore." Ella thought about something while waiting for her sister, looking outside the window at the large flakes of snow and dreaming about the soon meeting with her own beautiful baby. A couple of minutes later, a slightly worried and even disheveled Polly appeared on the doorstep of the living room. Ella frowned. "Why are you so disheveled?" she asked. "Did the spammers offer you junk again?" And then, from behind the door, grew a large male figure. A tan, insanely handsome man in a ridiculous cap and long coat smiled broadly, holding in his hand a gorgeous bouquet of scarlet roses. Ella simply could not believe her eyes. "Alex," she was amazed, "what are you doing here?" He ignored her question, walked inside the room, brushed past an already glowing Polly, and slipped his bouquet in Ella. "I couldn't forget that night. You're the best woman in this world, and I gave up everything to find you." Then he turned his gaze to her large pregnant belly covered with a warm blanket. "God," he marveled, "if I understand this baby correctly." He was silent for a moment. "Yours?" Ella confirmed his suspicions. After the birth of their son, Ella and Alex married. Alex left his distant islands and moved to his hometown for the sake of his family. As it turned out, dwelling on the islands, he managed to save a certain amount of money and used it to open a surfing school. After giving birth to a child, Ella quickly returned to her former form, and after much persuasion from her husband, decided to fulfill her dream. She decided to go on the circus stage as an acrobat with a solo number. Not at once, but still quite quickly, she perfectly established herself and several times caught her best glory. And then, soberly assessing her strength, went to work as a coach. With the money Ella had left after selling her business, she bought a villa in the Philippines. Every winter, the family spent there, surfing, relaxing, and swimming in the sea. So much for the age of the berry woman. Ella finally met her true destiny. It took Ella many years to realize a simple truth: no matter how terrible a person's problems may seem, they pale in comparison to how huge our world is. No matter how much it may seem that all is lost, that the whole world has collapsed, almost everything and always can be survived or changed for the better. Thank you for joining us today on Deep Stories. Be sure to like and subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on our next video.